It was just another lively evening at Romano's bistro. The air was filled with the mouth-watering aroma of freshly baked bread, rich sauces, and sizzling meat. The hum of conversation from the dining room blended seamlessly with the rhythmic clatter of pots and pans in the kitchen. Every now and then, the laughter of happy customers punctuated the comforting sounds of the restaurant. It was a well-orchestrated symphony that had become the heartbeat of this little Italian eatery. At the center of it all stood Chef Marco, the quiet genius who had turned Romano's into the most talked-about bistro in the city. Marco wasn't the type to draw attention to himself. He wasn't flashy or loud like the celebrity chefs you saw on TV. Instead, his strength lay in his unshakable focus and his meticulous attention to detail. Each dish that left his kitchen wasn't just food, it was art. Marco treated every plate like a canvas, using ingredients to tell a story. He worked swiftly but gracefully, his hands moving with practiced precision. His brow furrowed slightly as he sprinkled a final touch of fresh herbs over a plate of fettuccine alfredo. He stepped back, examined the dish like a painter admiring their work, and gave a small nod of approval before handing it to the waiter. To most people, Marco was just a dedicated chef. A perfectionist who poured his heart and soul into his craft. Customers loved him for the magic he brought to their tables, but no one really knew much about him. Marco preferred it that way. He had a quiet presence that commanded respect but didn't invite too many questions. Yet, beneath his calm and composed exterior, there was a history he didn't talk about, a past he had worked hard to leave behind. Tonight, however, that past would come roaring back in a way no one could have predicted. The evening was running smoothly, just like any other. The kitchen staff was busy preparing orders, waiters were weaving through tables, and diners were savoring their meals. Marco liked nights like these. They were predictable, orderly, and allowed him to focus entirely on his work. But just as he began to plate a risotto, an unsettling sound broke through the hum of the restaurant. The low, guttural rumble of motorcycle engines echoed from the street outside. It started faintly but grew louder, like a distant storm rolling closer. The noise made the glasses on the shelves tremble slightly, a tiny warning of what was coming. The staff in the kitchen paused for a moment, exchanging uneasy glances. Even the waiters in the dining room slowed their pace, the cheerful atmosphere dimming slightly as the sound grew louder and more invasive. "Is that?" one of the younger waiters began to ask, his voice trailing off. Marco didn't look up. He simply continued working, slicing a loaf of crusty bread with the same calm precision he always had. But there was a slight tension in his jaw, a tiny flicker of recognition in his eyes. Outside, the engines roared to a stop, and a heavy silence followed. Then came the sound of boots hitting the pavement, loud and deliberate. A group of figures appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm glow of the restaurant's lights. The infamous biker gang, the Steel Wolves, had arrived. The Steel Wolves were known throughout the city, and not for good reasons. They were loud, reckless, and had a reputation for causing trouble wherever they went. Stories about their antics were passed around like urban legends, tales of bar brawls, property damage, and intimidation. Most places learned to shut their doors early when the wolves came around. But Romano's wasn't just any place, and Chef Marco wasn't just any chef. The group stepped inside, their heavy boots thudding against the polished wooden floor. There were 5 of them, each wearing a leather jacket adorned with the gang's snarling wolf emblem. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a scruffy beard and a scar running down his cheek, scanned the room with a smug, almost predatory grin. His name was Tank, a name as intimidating as his reputation. The atmosphere in the dining room shifted immediately. Conversations hushed, and diners looked nervously at their plates, trying to avoid eye contact. A waitress froze mid-step, the tray in her hand wobbling slightly as she glanced toward the kitchen. Tank sauntered over to a table in the middle of the room and dropped himself into a chair with a thud. The other gang members followed suit, spreading out and occupying tables with little regard for the other diners. They spoke loudly, their rough laughter cutting through the quiet tension. One of the waiters, a young man named Alex, hesitated near the kitchen door. He looked at Marco, uncertainty written all over his face. Should I ask them to leave?" he whispered. Marco shook his head, his expression unreadable. "Serve them like any other customer," he said simply. "But Marco, they're—" "Just do your job," Marco interrupted, his voice calm but firm. Reluctantly, Alex nodded and approached the gang with a forced smile. "Welcome to Romano's. Can I get you started with something to drink?" Tank leaned back in his chair, smirking. "We're not here for drinks, kid. Just tell your chef to whip up something quick. We don't have all night." Alex swallowed hard and nodded before retreating to the kitchen. When he relayed the order, the rest of the staff exchanged nervous glances. Marco, however, remained unfazed. He wiped his hands on a towel, adjusted his apron, and started gathering ingredients. The kitchen staff watched him carefully, trying to gauge his reaction. They had seen Marco handle stressful situations before, demanding customers, tight deadlines, even the occasional kitchen mishap. But this felt different. The tension in the air was almost palpable, and for the first time, they noticed something unusual about Marco's demeanor. He wasn't just calm, he was controlled, deliberate, and unshaken. Outside in the dining room, the gang's laughter grew louder. Tank was tossing sugar packets across the table like a bored child, while another member tapped his knife against a glass, producing an irritating clinking sound. The other diners were growing increasingly uncomfortable, some even whispering about leaving early. But Marco wasn't paying attention to the noise. He was focused on the dish in front of him, his hands moving with mechanical precision as he chopped, sautéed, and plated. The staff couldn't help but wonder, was Marco really this calm, or was he hiding something? What kind of man could stay so composed in the face of such blatant intimidation? The answer, though unknown to them, was simple. Marco wasn't afraid of the steel wolves. He had faced far worse in his past. And while the gang thought they were in control, they had no idea that they had just walked into the wrong kitchen. The steel wolves weren't known for their patience. In fact, waiting was something they didn't believe they should ever have to do. The gang sat sprawled across their tables, creating a spectacle for the rest of the restaurant. A couple sitting near the window exchanged nervous glances, whispering between bites. A child at a table in the corner stared openly at the men, his mother quickly pulling him closer, whispering, "Don't stare. Just eat." Tank leaned back in his chair, balancing it on its two back legs. He tapped his fingers rhythmically against the table, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He thrived on this: the quiet fear, the stolen glances, the way people seemed to shrink in his presence. It fed his ego in a way nothing else could. "Where's that food?" one of the bikers called out loudly, his gravelly voice cutting through the hushed murmurs in the room. He slammed his fist on the table, causing the silverware to rattle. "We're starving over here." Behind the kitchen doors, Alex flinched at the sound, his hands fumbling as he attempted to load a tray with breadsticks. "Marco, they're getting impatient," he said nervously, his voice just above a whisper. Marco didn't respond immediately. He was standing at the counter, drizzling a velvety sauce over a dish with steady hands. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost detached. "They'll get their food when it's ready." The staff exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't that Marco was being deliberately dismissive, it was just his way. He had a quiet authority that made people follow his lead, even if they didn't fully understand his reasoning. "What if they cause trouble?" another waiter asked, his voice trembling slightly. Marco turned to face him, his dark eyes steady. "If they cause trouble, we'll handle it. But right now, focus on your work." There was something in his tone, something unyielding, almost unshakable. It was as though Marco had already calculated every possible outcome and decided it wasn't worth worrying about. Back in the dining room, Tank's patience was wearing thin. He picked up a fork and began spinning it between his fingers like a knife, the polished metal catching the light. "I thought this place was supposed to be the best," he said loudly, his voice dripping with mockery. "What's taking so long? Did the chef fall asleep back there?" His cronies laughed uproariously, their laughter echoing off the walls. Tank leaned forward, his chair slamming back onto all four legs. He pounded the table with his fist for emphasis. "Hey, chef," he bellowed, his voice booming. "What's the hold up? Or do we need to come back there and show you how it's done?" The dining room fell completely silent. Even the clatter of dishes in the kitchen stopped for a moment. Everyone waited, breath held, to see what would happen next. The door to the kitchen swung open, and Marco stepped out, wiping his hands on a white towel. He moved with the same measured calm he always had, his posture relaxed and his expression neutral. He approached Tank's table, stopping just a few feet away. "I understand you're hungry," Marco said evenly, his voice neither loud nor soft but carrying an undeniable weight. "The food will be out shortly." Tank stared at Marco, his lips curling into a sneer. "Is that right?" he said, leaning back in his chair again. "Because it seems like you're taking your sweet time. Maybe you need a little motivation." One of the bikers snickered, and another muttered something under his breath that made the group laugh again. Marco's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch, didn't bristle, didn't react the way they expected. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, his gaze steady. "Good food takes time," he said simply. "If you'd prefer something quick, there's a fast food place down the street." The room went silent again. No one dared to breathe. The staff exchanged wide-eyed glances, their shock mirrored by the diners. It wasn't what Marco had said, it was how he said it. Calm. Controlled. Completely unafraid. For a moment, Tank seemed caught off guard. His smirk faltered, and he studied Marco as if trying to figure him out. Then, just as quickly, the arrogance returned. He leaned forward, planting both elbows on the table. "You've got guts, chef. I'll give you that," he said, his voice low and threatening. "But guts can only get you so far." Marco didn't respond. He held Tank's gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked back into the kitchen. As the door swung shut behind him, the staff erupted into whispers. "What was that?" Alex hissed. "Marco, are you crazy? Do you know who those guys are?" "They're customers," Marco replied calmly, returning to his station. "And they'll get their food just like everyone else." "But..." "Enough," Marco said, his tone firm but not unkind. "Get back to work." In the dining room, Tank leaned back in his chair, his smirk fading into a frown. He didn't like being brushed off, and he liked even less that the quiet, unassuming chef had done it in front of his gang. He tapped his fingers against the table, the rhythm growing faster as his frustration built. "What do you want to do, boss?" one of the bikers asked, leaning in close. Tank didn't answer immediately. He was watching the kitchen door, his mind working. There was something about that chef, something different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but it irked him. "Let's wait and see," Tank said finally, his voice low. "This ain't over yet." Back in the kitchen, Marco continued working as if nothing had happened. He moved with his usual efficiency, his hands steady and his focus unwavering. But deep down, he knew the night was far from over. Marco wasn't a man who courted conflict, but he wasn't one to shy away from it either. He had spent years building a life of peace, a life centered around food and creativity. But there were parts of his past that couldn't be erased, parts that had shaped him into the man he was today. And if the Steel Wolves thought they could intimidate him, they were in for a rude awakening. They stormed in like they owned the place. The clamor of their heavy boots and the scrape of chairs being dragged back filled Romano's bistro, piercing the warm ambience. Leather jackets gleamed under the restaurant's soft lights, each adorned with the snarling wolf emblem that sent a chill through anyone who recognized it. The infamous steel wolves were here, and the air instantly grew heavier. At their head was Tank, a mountain of a man with a thick, scruffy beard and a voice like gravel dragged across stone. He scanned the room, his piercing gaze challenging anyone who dared to look his way. He didn't need to announce his presence, the tension in the air said it all. Tank approached the nearest table, pulling out a chair with a screech that made every diner flinch. With a loud thud, he dropped himself into the seat and leaned back, his leather jacket stretching across his broad shoulders. His gang followed suit, sprawling across tables and kicking their feet up on chairs without a second thought. "We're not here for your fancy food, chef," Tank announced, his deep voice cutting through the quiet like a knife. He slapped the table with a meaty hand, making the silverware jump. "Bring us something, quick. Or there'll be trouble." In the kitchen, the staff froze. Alex, the young waiter who had spoken to Marco earlier, peeked nervously through the kitchen door. The bikers' voices boomed, their laughter rough and grating. "What do we do?" Alex whispered to no one in particular. His hands trembled as he held a tray of fresh breadsticks. "Shouldn't we call someone?" "Call who?" another waiter whispered back. "You think the cops want to deal with them? They'll just make things worse." Marco, standing at his station, didn't say a word. His hands moved with practiced precision as he sliced into a loaf of bread, the blade of his knife glinting in the light. He seemed completely unbothered by the chaos unfolding in the dining room. "Why isn't Marco saying anything?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because he knows what he's doing," an older waitress muttered, though even she didn't sound entirely convinced. Marco wiped his hands on a clean towel, set the knife down, and walked to the door. He pushed it open just enough to glance into the dining room. His dark eyes took in the scene: the toppled chairs, the gang's loud antics, the uneasy faces of the diners. Tank caught sight of him and grinned. There he is. The man of the hour. He spread his arms wide in a mock gesture of welcome. "Chef, where's the service, huh? We're hungry." Marco stepped out fully, his posture calm and upright. He wiped his hands again, though they were already clean. "Your food will be out shortly," he said, his tone even, devoid of emotion. Tank leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table. "Oh, we don't want shortly, chef. We want now. Or are you scared? Afraid of us roughing up your little kitchen?" The gang erupted into laughter, their voices echoing off the walls. A glass toppled over as one of the bikers slammed the table in amusement, the clear liquid spreading across the polished wood. Marco's expression didn't change. He stood there for a moment, his silence carrying a weight that even Tank couldn't quite ignore. Then, without another word, Marco turned and walked back into the kitchen. The bikers laughed harder, taking his retreat as submission. Tank leaned back in his chair, his smug grin spreading wider. "That's what I thought," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "The big bad chef doesn't have much to say, does he?" Behind the kitchen doors, tension simmered. The waitstaff whispered nervously among themselves, their words tumbling over each other in hushed panic. "Why didn't he say anything?" Alex asked again, his voice trembling. "Maybe he doesn't want to provoke them," another waiter offered. "Provoke them? They're already acting like they own the place." Marco ignored the chatter. He returned to his station, picking up where he had left off as if nothing had happened. His hands moved with the same steady precision, slicing, dicing, and arranging ingredients with care. "Marco," Alex pressed, his voice quivering, "what are we going to do?" They're getting angrier." Marco glanced up briefly. "They're just making noise," he said simply. "But..." "Focus on your job," Marco interrupted, his tone calm but firm. He didn't raise his voice, but the authority in it was enough to quiet Alex. Out in the dining room, the gang's patience was wearing thin. Tank grabbed a fork and began spinning it between his fingers, the polished metal flashing under the lights. One of the other bikers, a wiry man with a shaved head and a sneer that never seemed to leave his face, started tapping his knife against a glass. Clink. 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 The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, and grating. Diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the tension in the room rising with each tap. "What's taking so long?" Tank bellowed suddenly, slamming the fork down onto the table. The loud clatter made a waitress jump, nearly spilling a tray of drinks. The gang laughed again, their rough voices filling the room. One of them tipped back in his chair, balancing precariously on two legs as he reached for the salt shaker on a nearby table. Another biker leaned back, tossing sugar packets into the air and catching them in his mouth like a bored child. Tank stood, his towering frame casting a shadow over the table. He knocked over a glass with a careless swipe of his hand, sending it crashing to the floor. "Hey, chef," he called out, his voice booming. "You scared back there? What's the hold up?" The gang erupted into laughter again, but this time, the sound felt forced, like they were trying too hard to maintain their dominance. Back in the kitchen, Marco stood silently at his station. He could hear every word, every laugh, every clink of silverware. But he didn't react. Instead, he placed the finishing touches on a plate of pasta, his hands as steady as ever. "Marco," the older waitress ventured cautiously, "are you sure this is a good idea? I mean, they're not exactly the forgiving type." Marco looked up, meeting her gaze with an expression that was unreadable but resolute. "They don't need forgiveness," he said simply. "They need food." The waitress frowned, unsure whether to be reassured or even more worried. Tank slammed his fist on the table again, this time with enough force to rattle the plates. "That's it," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "We're going back there. If the chef can't bring the food to us, we'll bring ourselves to him." He took a step toward the kitchen, but just as he reached the door, it swung open. Marco emerged, carrying a tray laden with steaming dishes. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He didn't flinch under Tank's glare, didn't react to the gang's taunts. He placed the tray on the table and began setting down the plates with the same care he gave every dish. The bikers watched him, their laughter fading slightly as they registered the chef's calmness. "There you go," Marco said, his voice even. "Enjoy your meal." Tank stared at him for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Marco met his gaze without blinking, the silence between them stretching uncomfortably long. Then, without a word, Marco turned and walked back to the kitchen. The gang erupted into laughter again, but it was different this time, less confident, more forced. Tank watched Marco's retreating figure, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face. It wasn't fear, but it wasn't amusement either. He didn't know it yet, but the quiet chef had unsettled him. And that was just the beginning. Tank sat down heavily, his glare fixed on the plate Marco had just delivered. The other gang members snickered, poking at their dishes with forks and making exaggerated faces. "This what you call food?" one of them sneered, stabbing a perfectly cooked piece of chicken. "Looks like something from one of those cooking shows my old lady watches." "Yeah," another chimed in, swirling his fork in the pasta. "You trying to impress someone, chef?" Their laughter was loud, but not a single word drew Marco back out of the kitchen. He didn't need to see them mocking his work, he had heard it all before. Tank, however, wasn't laughing. His fork hovered above his plate, his eyes narrowing as he stared down at the dish. Despite his bravado, The aroma was enticing: garlic, herbs, and something rich and buttery that hinted at a depth of flavor he wasn't used to. Reluctantly, he took a bite. For a moment, everything went still. The flavors hit his tongue all at once, bold and refined, perfectly balanced. Tank's sneer faltered as his senses wrestled with the unfamiliar combination of disdain and genuine admiration. "Boss," the wiry biker asked, his tone suddenly uncertain. "What's wrong?" Tank blinked and snapped out of it, his expression hardening. He slammed his fork down onto the table. "What's wrong?" he barked. "This is what's wrong. Who asked for this pretentious garbage?" His gang quickly echoed his outburst, their voices rising in unison as they jeered and shoved their plates away. A few glasses toppled, spilling drinks onto the table and floor. In the kitchen, the staff winced as the noise from the dining room grew louder. "They're not happy," Alex whispered, peering nervously through the small window in the door. "Marco, they're making a scene." Marco didn't look up from his station. He was carefully plating another order, his hands as steady as ever. "Let them," he said calmly. Alex turned to him, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Let them? Marco, they're smashing things out there. What if they come back here? What if they—" "Alex," Marco interrupted, his voice low but firm. "If you're too scared to serve them, I will." Alex swallowed hard, his throat dry. He wanted to argue, to say something that would convince Marco to take this more seriously, but there was something in the chef's tone and unshakable confidence that made it impossible to protest. Back in the dining room, Tank stood again, his patience completely worn out. He pushed his chair back with such force that it toppled over, the loud crash silencing the restaurant. Every pair of eyes turned to him as he began pacing toward the kitchen, his heavy boots thudding against the floor. "All right, that's it," Tank growled. "I've had enough of this chef's little games." His gang cheered him on, their laughter and jeers filling the air. Tank reached the kitchen door and shoved it open with one massive hand. The staff froze in place, their faces pale as they stared at the imposing figure standing in the doorway. But Marco didn't even turn around. The air in the kitchen felt electric, thick with tension as Tank took a step inside. His towering frame seemed to dominate the space, his shadow stretching across the polished counters. "You think you're funny, huh?" Tank said, his voice low and menacing. "Hiding back here while we're out there waiting? You think you're too good to talk to us?" Marco finally turned, his movements slow and deliberate. He met Tank's glare with a calm, steady gaze, his expression unreadable. "I served you your food," Marco said simply. "What you do with it is up to you." Tank stared at him, momentarily thrown off by the chef's calmness. He had expected panic, even, but Marco's composure was unsettling. "You got a smart mouth," Tank said, his voice rising. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "You think you're tough? That you can just brush us off like that?" Marco didn't flinch. He stood his ground, his posture relaxed but unwavering. "I think you've had enough attention for one night," he said, his tone firm but not confrontational. The words hung in the air like a challenge. The other staff members exchanged nervous glances, their fear palpable. For a moment, Tank didn't move. His jaw tightened, and his fists clenched at his sides. Then, without warning, he reached out and grabbed the edge of Marco's counter, flipping over a neatly arranged tray of ingredients. The crash echoed through the kitchen, scattering vegetables and utensils across the floor. "Clean that up, chef," Tank sneered, his lips curling into a smirk. The room went silent. Every staff member froze, waiting for Marco to react. Marco bent down slowly, picking up a single tomato that had rolled across the floor. He placed it carefully on the counter, wiped his hands on his apron, and looked up at Tank. "Are you done?" Marco asked quietly. Tank's smirk faltered. He had expected an outburst, maybe even fear, but Marco's calmness was unnerving. I said, "Are you done?" Marco repeated, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made even the gang members lingering in the doorway hesitate. Tank took a step back, his confidence wavering for the first time. There was something about Marco, something unspoken but undeniable. It wasn't just his calm demeanor or his refusal to be intimidated. It was something deeper, something that made Tank feel like he was standing on unsteady ground. "You're lucky I'm in a good mood," Tank muttered, his voice lower now. He turned and stomped out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind him. The staff let out a collective breath they hadn't realized they were holding. "What just happened?" Alex asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marco didn't answer. He simply returned to his station and began cleaning up the mess Tank had made, his movements as calm and methodical as ever. Out in the dining room,